Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. And today I just wanted to talk about the books that I've been reading this week. And just also quickly before I begin, thank you also so much for everybody who's been putting in their questions into the Q&A bit from last week's video. There is still time. It'll probably be another week or two until I sit down and actually film it. So please, by all means, keep those questions coming on last week's one. Fab. But let's talk a little bit about the books that I've been reading this week. So I'm in that stage where I've got lots of books to give back to the library, and so I'm kind of that fun thing of just sort of reading them all and giving them back. And sort of as a result, there's some quite fun ones in there. This was very much sort of books that I put reservations on a couple of months ago, and all kind of came in at the same time. And I'm like, great. In many ways, it is great, actually. But let's talk about one of them here. So Greg Marshall's book, Leg, which is a memoir that talks about his relationship to his body as both a gay man and as somebody with cerebral palsy. And so he grows up with sort of tight tendons, as he keeps on referring to them. And that's sort of his explanation for everything in the world of, oh, you know, sorry, I can't quite sort of stand straight or kind of walk in a straight line in the same way as everybody else, perhaps, because I've got these tight tendons. And that's kind of the family myth or the family story for a really long time. And as it sort of goes on, it sort of transpires that for his family, they just can't really accept that it's a medical term. They sort of just think, oh, he, you know, there's a sliding scale of tightness of tendons and he's just sort of on the tighter end and it's fine. And there's nothing wrong with him. He's perfectly fine. And the book kind of explores how he has to essentially almost learn to be able to talk about himself as having a disability or a condition or whatever. And sort of tied in with that is the sort of complicated family history around parts of that as well. His father becomes quite sick when he is relatively young, as in when Greg Marshall himself is quite young. But Greg Marshall then has to sort of reconcile a lot of this in terms of his father. So his father becomes quite ill when Greg himself is quite young. He also watches as his sister has sort of various conditions as well. And so he is sort of very cognizant of the fact that for his mother, this is quite, she sort of feels caught in between a lot of people who are unwell or disabled or whatever in various different guises. And so he almost doesn't want to add more fuel to this. He sort of wants to be somebody who kind of does everything right. And he's almost got this sort of perfectionist thing of wanting to be okay for his mum. But actually what kind of transpires in the rest of the book is this really interesting discussion of his sexuality and his disability and how the two often meet in sort of unusual ways. So, you know, when he's meeting men for the first time, what relationship does he have with his body if he's almost apologizing for his body before he's even got there? And so lots of these sorts of things that come up. And I just thought it was a really interesting memoir. Next up, after really enjoying Fair Play by her, I next read The Summer Book by Tove Jansson. And this was just, the lighting is really off in this bit, there we go. And The Summer Book is essentially autofiction. I don't know if that's the right term necessarily, but there's a kind of fictionalized version of sort of real events that talks about a grandmother and a granddaughter and their sort of little adventures and bits of joy together. And it's just a really pleasant read. It's there's a real lightness of touch to the way that Jansson writes about her the kind of the relationship between generations of, you know, this young girl being full of curiosity and wonder and the grandmother kind of stoking those fires by sort of showing her all the amazing things in the world, but also trying to protect her and also trying to show her just what is out there. And there's something just so joyous and beautiful about this book that I just really, really took to. I read it quite quickly, pretty much in sort of one sitting. And I think for me, it was just, there's something just so tender, pardon me, about the way that the book brings together these two characters and allows them to really have time and space to just play around and look for joy with each other. Next up, I read Thunderclap by Laura Cumming. And this is a book that sort of ostensibly at the heart of it is about art history and particularly sort of artists from the Netherlands in a very specific period of time. But really what it does in a broader sense is just, again, sort of imbue so much of the the period with the sense of wonder. So she talks a lot about various artists who are particularly around the town of Delft in the Netherlands. And she talks about how, these sort of famous painters all kind of came together, their lives, the fact that for many of them, they were either next door neighbors of each other or lived quite close to each other. They all, often they knew each other. There's always this sort of temptation that she writes about to see art history as this sort of unbroken chain of, person A influences person B, they then influence person C, and, there's this sort of lineage. And some parts of that do happen, but she talks about how painters were sort of popping up left, right and centre, and, they were often sharing work and influencing each other, but also it's not as easy as a simple sort of one line. But I think what's really interesting, and this is sort of said at the beginning of the book, and then almost when it comes again later, it almost reads like a kind of surprise twist, even though it would have been coming, is this thunderclap from the title. And so although it's a non-fiction book, it kind of has a sort of fictional, well, not fictional element, but a kind of a narrative element that makes it feel at times like you're reading a novel. And this thunderclap was a sort of sudden basically almost explosion, this sort of event that happened that suddenly created these sorts of sonic booms and everything else in the area, that destroyed houses, that sort of suddenly devastated an area. And so we then see how that's viewed through the lens of art. So these artists not only watch as bits of their town and parts of their livelihood perhaps even disappear, but then we see how some artists make their mark by being the kinds of artists who are obsessed with this event and constantly try to paint the moment that something happened, and sort of paint the moment that explosions went off, the moment just before, the moment just after, all of these sorts of things. And so actually for a book that I hadn't really, it's not one I'd necessarily heard of, I hadn't really known a great deal about it, and it's not really my world in the sense that I don't know a great amount about art, and particularly Dutch painters from a very specific time. But there was something absolutely captivating about the way this book pulled together this narrative I just thought was really quite special, and I really enjoyed it. Next up, a few shorter books. First, Prater Violet by Christopher Isherwood. So I read this as part of a book club, and it's a really short little book. I've enjoyed a few other books by Isherwood before, and this was just this sort of slightly strange book in some ways. It's sort of in Isherwood style. It's almost a fictionalized retelling of something real. And in this case, when Isherwood was working as a sort of helping in the film industry, essentially, and he's helping to try and put together this film and make everything come together, everything's going wrong, and in the backdrop of it, we are starting to see World War II, and a lot of this book is around Austria, and so there's this sort of creeping rise of something lingering and dangerous. And so the first half of this book I didn't necessarily connect with as much, but then actually the second half is where it really picks up some of that tension, and there's this real sense of something underlying and nefarious going on, but it's often disguised and kind of in the background, and we're only seeing through characters' eyes, and they often don't acknowledge it. And it kind of ends in this big speech that is about not turning your eyes away when sort of atrocities are happening, which feels quite prescient and quite appropriate for what's happening now. And so it's this really interesting kind of thing. It isn't my favorite of the Isherwoods I've read, but I'm kind of glad to have sort of been back in his world for a little bit more, because I've really enjoyed what I have read of his. And next up, two poetry collections that were both shortlisted for the same prize, the Writers' Prize. And so I'll talk about them separately in another Writers' Prize video. But let's get started first with Self-Portrait as Othello by Jansson Allen-Paisant. And this is a really fascinating poetry collection. It takes as its core idea the character of Othello from Shakespeare. And it looks at the kind of complexities that make him up as a man. So he is this black man in the midst of other cultures where he is often the only black man around. He is seen as sort of sort of various stereotypes and various things are projected onto him. But he sort of exists and tries to exert power in these worlds. And the poet here does some really clever sleight of hand to sort of play out this metaphor, but without it feeling like a really labored thing, I think. So he takes the kind of core idea of himself as a man who is his Allen-Paisant is kind of given to him to some degree. It's something that they quite enjoy having as a name, but he is somebody who has spent a lot of time in other cultures. He's sort of got some Senegalese family. He speaks French, spent some time in France and in Italy. He sort of doesn't really have a home sometimes. You know, he sort of sees himself as sort of wandering slightly. And in that sense, he kind of identifies with the character of Othello, and he starts to use Othello to explore wider themes around race and identity, but particularly also just the ways that otherness and outsiderness is formed. So I found it really quite captivating. It's the language is very punchy and vital and real. It doesn't go in for big flowery declarations of anything. It's a very real and honest set of poems, and I just found it really quite captivating. And last but not least, shortlisted for the same poetry category of the Writers' Prize as Self-Portraits Othello, we have The Home Child by Liz Berry. And this is a poetry collection that takes as its inspiration an historical period that I actually knew basically nothing about at all, which is that there was this moment where orphaned or otherwise sort of vulnerable children were shipped from the UK to Canada between the period of about 1860 and 1960. And during that time, about 100,000 children went over to Canada. And it was sort of a way of, I suppose, almost dealing with two problems at once, which was, you know, these vulnerable children in the UK, and there maybe not being space for them to be able to, the resources for them to be supported properly, but also the Canada sort of having future labour shortages and all this kind of stuff as well. So it was this sort of thing, and apparently sort of something like 10% of Canadians to this day are kind of have some family link to the children who moved over at this time. And what we then see is this really interesting set of poems that almost read like a novel at times. It has a sort of episodic quality of kind of constantly driving forward a narrative. And The Home Child really explores what it might be like to be some of those children. And Liz Berry herself has sort of family who were moved over to Canada, and so she explores that through sort of a personal lens as well. But what is really quite telling and really interesting about this book is the way that it attempts to really look through the eyes of these young children. And so we see their fear, their trepidation, the absolute terror that they have of leaving. But then we see these little moments and pockets of joy where they really enjoy something in their home area, or towards the end of this book where the woman we're sort of the young woman we're spending most of our time with in this book sees a young boy who's also been shipped over to Canada, and she spends time with him and really comes to sort of love his rebellious spirit. And so we kind of it's a really tender and heartfelt book, and I just thought it was really quite clever in how it was able to piece together a narrative in a way that just felt so true and so real. So yeah, I really, really enjoyed this. And that takes me to the end of the books that I read this week. These have been, there we go. These have been some fun ones, and it's sort of always quite interesting, I think, with just how many sort of incredible books are coming out all the time. But I also, with reading the Isherwood book, it sort of made me realise just how much of my reading, I think, has also been, if it's not been Booker, has been, books released within the last few years. So it's also been quite fun to sort of leap back a little bit and read something from another time. But anyway, I've been Bob the Booker. I hope you are doing really well, and please do keep those questions coming in last week's video, or if they're easier, just pop them in this video as well. I'm easy, I'll check both. And take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye, have a great week.